So, as if it's hard enough having, I'm used to, I guess I should say, living in the shadows, but, now it's sort of happening all over again, so live in front of you. If I'm seem sort of conflicted and anxious, I am. Not because I'm nervous of speaking here, it's because, aside from this sort of return to Boston, New England has been great. It's been, really nostalgic and everything, because the Red Sox are amidst a total catastrophe right now. I was just checking the score, and I find myself having to root for the Yankees because they're playing the Rays, and the Rays are catching up with the Red Sox, and it's a disaster. So I'm very torn up about all of that right now. And of course, yes, my sister talked about how we're different people, and we're going to share the stage in a little bit. But I thought how appropriate. She puts up pictures of her really incredibly sweet children, 2 daughters and their amazing dog, and I put up crazy pictures of comic books and action and weird violence and stuff like that. But I'm going to get to that. I'm going to let it sort of scroll through, and I'm going to get to what I'm doing with Liquid Comics and what we're trying to do with some of this wild stuff. But like every good comic book store, I'm going to tell you the origin story of what you see here. Origin stories, Batman witnessing his parents, killed in an alleyway, and how that sort of defines his quest for justice. Spider-Man getting bit by a radioactive spider. I'm going to share with you the origin story of this stuff, of kind of what I'm doing right now. And it starts in February of 2001. I worked as a journalist for an organization called Channel One News, which is based out in Los Angeles. At the time, it broadcast to schools all over the country, so most of you probably wouldn't have heard of it unless you saw it in high school many years ago. And people like Anderson Cooper and Lisa Ling and myself were these correspondents at a very young age who were sort of dispatched around the world to cover stories that otherwise, sadly not even just teenagers, but most Americans aren't aware of. So we were working on a joint venture with a television network to take it outside of the classrooms and really create this dynamic new television show. In classic Hollywood style, we described it as 60 Minutes meets Buffy the Vampire Slayer. We were sitting around this table talking about stories that we were going to do for the pilot episode. I had recently read in the New York Times Sunday magazine an article on these madrasas, these religious schools in northwest frontier part of Pakistan that U.S. intelligence agencies called terrorist training camps, and the people in Pakistan called just religious schools that gave access to students who otherwise wouldn't have access to education. So I proposed, hey, we should just go and knock on the door and with cameras and find out for ourselves. Great sort of first-person storytelling. I remember at the time we were sitting around this table with all these executives, and one of the executives from this network said, well, gosh, terrorism, it's just February of 2001, so just put it in some context. Terrorism just seems so far away. If you're going to do terrorism, we should go to Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the IRA, but this Islamic stuff, who knows? It just seems so irrelevant. Somebody else said, well, there's probably lots of guns there, and that's good for television, and that could be interesting. Someone else, bright, Hollywood executive said, Paramount Pictures has this movie coming out this summer called The Sum of All Fears, and Ben Affleck is in it. So maybe if Ben went with you, that could be really cool. Somebody else said, I think the E&O insurance is going to be too high on that, so scrap that idea. So fortunately for me, my organization, Channel One, said, that's a really cool story for us. We don't need this other network. So, a few months later, they sent me off to Pakistan. Of course, my family comes from India. It turns out that I was the first family member to go back to Pakistan since partition. My grandparents had originally been from a Pakistani city and had migrated in 1948 during partition, and no one had been back in 52 years until I went. The first city we went to was Peshawar. It's this city up in the northwest frontier part of Pakistan. And the first thing I did, checking into the Marriott Hotel, which subsequently, a couple years later, by the way, was bombed and no longer exists, is I went to the television, like I always do, and I turned it on, and I started flipping through the channels. First thing I saw, of course, was Baywatch. Second thing I saw was fashion TV with these amazingly emaciated women walking down the runway of Milan and Paris. And the third thing, talk about a tangled hierarchy I saw, was Beavis and Butthead. Thank you, Malika. So, pretty interesting introduction to Pakistan. The next day, we got in the back of you have to be escorted up to, the Khyber Pass, which is this sort of legendary pass through the northwest frontier part of Pakistan, leads up to Afghanistan, and you have to be led up there by the Pakistani military, and they drop you off at the border of this Khyber, which is still part of Pakistan, but from there they say, hey, you're kind of on your own. Like, even the military doesn't go in past that point. What they do suggest is you hire one of the local militias, and you know all this, from doing your research beforehand, so you come armed with cigarettes, magazines, and cash, and you hire one of these militias, and they're very friendly if you have the requisite items, and they put you in the back of a pickup truck, and you enter the Khyber. And you drive through the Khyber, and I remember that so clearly because I was sitting in the back of this pickup truck, and one of the guys who was wearing a sort of bandana handed me an AK-47, and I took it, because that's what you do when someone hands you such a thing, of course, and he said, shoot, like up in the air. And I shot. I'd never shot an AK-47 before. And so I shot, and then immediately on the ridges around, other people started shooting. It was like this sort of male ritual. And I remember it as like the most overtly male thing I've ever done. I mean, I'm in the back of a pickup truck shooting an AK-47 and loving it. So, that was sort of the first memorable experience. Then we got to this madrasa we had been planning on, and knocked on the door, and somebody answered, and we told them what we were there to do, and they said okay, and let us in, and they led me back to this back room, where the Mullah, sort of like the principal of the school, the one air-conditioned room. It was like 108 degrees at the time. And he took us to the back room, explained who we are. It was one of the great things working at Channel 1. You just told, I'm here on behalf of 20 million American students who have no idea who you are, what you do. We're not CNN, ABC. We have no agenda. We're just here as a couple of kids wanting to be told what it is. It's like the total, it's a great propaganda machine for anybody to sort of sit on the other side of those interviews. So this mullah, of course, was like, absolutely, we'd love to talk to you. He said, but before we do, let me, we're your hosts now, and in this part of the world, hospitality is a real, treasure. So he said, we have to be good hosts first. So first I want you to sit down, it's hot, have something to drink. Let me cut you some mangoes. We have the sweetest mangoes in Pakistan. So he took out a blade from, his robe, and some guy brought over some mangoes, and he started cutting them very skillfully. And, we just started chatting, and after we had slurped these mangoes and it was all messy, I sort of picked it up and I took it to a trash can, sort of towards the back wall. And as I was throwing it away, I noticed this picture on the wall. And this picture was of the guy I was interviewing, this old mullah, and Osama bin Laden. And, this was, again, February 2001, so Osama bin Laden wasn't sort of like the A-list celebrity that he would become. But he, I recognized him. He was still on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted, and the State Department had warned us and all of that sort of stuff before we'd come. So I picked up this picture and I brought it back to him, and I said, who is this guy? How do you know him? And he said, oh, he's this friend of mine. He's a very wise scholar. He, I do some special projects with him. A lot of times he comes here to Pakistan. I go to Afghanistan. These days he's having some visa problems, so he can't, come. But maybe next time, if you give us some warning, we'll take you. So I said, yeah, definitely. In my country, we call that a Pulitzer, so we'll definitely take you up on that. So, it was sort of a good segue. I started talking, interviewing him about the school, what did they do at the school, and I sort of bottom-lined it towards the end, and I said, look, in my part of the world, we're afraid of you. We're afraid of what's happening in these schools. Should we be? And he thought about it. And he said, well, let me ask you a question before I answer that. So I said, sure. He said, where did you stay last night? And I said, in the Marriott in Peshawar. And he said, did you turn on the television? And I said, yes. And he said, well, what did you see? And I told him, Baywatch, Fashion TV, Beavis and Butthead. And he said, well, maybe it's us who needs to be afraid of you. And I was reminded of something my father used to teach us growing up, that reality is an act of perception, and it's oftentimes where you sit and how you're looking at it that defines the way you literally metabolize the world. So I acknowledged that. I asked him, what is going on at this school? He said, why don't you, it's certainly, you're sitting in the one air-conditioned room, you're having Pepsi, in this room, this doesn't happen outside of this room, why don't you go see for yourself? So I walked out, and he said, feel free to talk to anybody, look wherever you want, see, there's no, shooting, guns, training, anything like that going on. So I went out, and I started walking the grounds, and, it was actually pretty barren. It was really hot, There were some kids studying the Quran, reciting the Quran, mostly, on dusty floors and stuff. And I saw one kid, and he was wearing a T-shirt that had Superman on it. And I was drawn to him. So I went, and I asked him if we could interview him. And we started talking, and it's a nice conversation. And towards the end of the conversation, I said, Superman, are you a fan of Superman? And he said, yeah, I guess, I like comic books and stuff like that. I said, do you have any superheroes here? Sort of Afghani superheroes. And he laughed, and he said, look around. And I said, why? He said, well, do you think there's much to believe in this country? There's not much to believe in right now. We don't have any superheroes. And so that sort of really resonated with me. I left the madrasa, I thanked them for being so hospitable. I remember actually when I was leaving, I told the mullah, I said, you've actually turned all of my expectations around. And he said, well, good, because, you are a guest, and we'd be ashamed if we were anything but, very hospitable. I said, of course, don't come back as our enemy. And he sort of was still holding that blade, and, he said, we're not so nice when you come back as our enemy. So, this was a sort of lasting impression of this place that, all my expectations had been altered and flipped around. I ended up going back to India, then flew back to New York, actually, even though I lived in Los Angeles. My fiance was in medical school at the time in New York, so I would often make these layovers on the way back home from these trips. And it was, early September at the time. So I spent the 7th through the 10th in New York with Candace, my fiance. And, there was really no rush to get back. I mean, we had this sort of great story in the can, but there was no reason to rush back and edit it. So after a couple days of great times with Candace, I boarded a flight on the morning of September 11th at 8 a.m. My sister remembers this really well because I boarded a flight in New York, and literally I'd shared the taxi to the airport with my father, who was boarding another flight to go to Detroit at 8 a.m. My mother was flying at the time from London to Los Angeles, so we were all on 3 different flights. Boarded our flight. I was thrilled because I had gotten upgraded to business class, and I remember taking off that morning and flying over Columbia University, my alma mater, and then you sort of curl back before, you take off and then go around the World Trade Center and see Statue of Liberty, and then come up the Hudson, see Columbia, et cetera, my alma mater, where Candace was doing her medical school. And I was thinking to myself, boy, I wish I wasn't leaving. What a spectacular day. Fell asleep in that comfortable business class seat. And 45 minutes later was woken up by the pilot, who said, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to make an emergency landing in Cincinnati, Ohio, because of a terrorist attack in the New York area. And, this was sort of vocabulary that I don't think anybody really could quite conceive of. Immediately, people started picking up those phones that, I would, including me, later discover was the most expensive phone call I've ever made. But even that, they cut off after, a couple minutes of people chattering, and people were talking like something's happening at the Twin Towers, et cetera. We landed in Cincinnati, and just as I was getting off the plane and seeing, the television screens, the first tower was sort of crumbling. And I had 37 messages from Malika, Candace, not from my parents who were still in the sky, and nobody knew what was going on. But I immediately sort of went into journalist mode. how am I going to get back to New York? This is going to be an amazing story. So I managed to hitch a ride with some guys. We got in a car and drove for 13 hours straight back to New York, managed with press passes, et cetera, to get down to ground zero by that evening. And I did a live shot for Channel 1 where we talked about it. And I remember so clearly, obviously, that night and just how surreal it was. People were still digging through the rubble, thinking that there would be survivors. I remember looking up one street, and there were all just high heel shoes from women who had thrown their shoes, as they were trying to flee from all the destruction. And after my live shot, after volunteering and part of the effort, I made my way to 14th Street, where they had sort of locked off the city. And now there were journalists who couldn't get in, so they were interviewing other journalists, to sort of get some firsthand account. Somebody grabbed me and started asking me all these questions. And I found myself, as I started doing those interviews, telling this story of where I had just been 3 weeks ago. And I think already there was this assumption that these worlds were intersecting. And in my mind, that was happening too, and I started to get really depressed. It took me 3 or 4 months to sort of work through that depression and realize I don't want to do this anymore. I can't do this because as journalists, you're taught to be objective. And how can you be objective in a subjective world when you know all of these things are tangled? During that time, went back to Israel several times. It was more violent, more depressing, more unemployment, more frustration, more anger. And I just realized I can't do this anymore. And I started thinking about that kid again. And I started thinking of what happens in a world where we do not have heroes, where we don't have superheroes, where we don't have people to aspire to. Osama bin Laden's get created. They fill that vacuum, and they become these sort of demagogues that create and wreak all this havoc. So I decided with my partner, my business partner, who's actually sitting in the room here, to start this company of creating comic books. And you were seeing the images, but we decided we wanted to put pencils and pens and paper in the hands of young South Asian creators, and we wanted to switch it from a backroom, outsourcer to creators of ideas. We wanted to give them a platform to create their heroes. And of course, nowadays, it's not so much, pencils and pieces of paper, it's apps and iPads, and so the cost of the business has gone up, as Sharad will attest to you. But we're having a good time, and we feel like we are giving tools to young people to reimagine the worlds that we live in and tell great stories. It's great to sort of be, I think someone else mentioned it yesterday, to be amongst my own kind. A lot of people ask all the time, you do all these varied projects, and what do you really do for a living? And I say, I'm a storyteller. So it's great to be here and to create with all of you.